Good evening and welcome to St. Andrew's Episcopal Church. We are delighted to be able to host this event, this conversation with Leslie Stainton about her book, Scarlett, and delighted that you all are here. Also, very happy that David is here from Literati Books with copies for sale that Leslie will be happy to sign after the presentation. Leslie's conversation partner this evening is Chris Watson. Chris is a longtime member here at St. Andrews. Both he and Leslie have been involved in our social justice ministries over the years. Chris works at the American Mathematical Society and is a member of the Ann Arbor City Council and is good friends with Leslie. And I think we're in for a terrific conversation. And I suspect most everyone here knows Leslie in one way or another, and so she needs very little introduction. If you know her at all, you know that she is a remarkable woman, and she has written a really remarkable book. If you haven't read it, I hope that this evening will kind of prime the pump and that you will get a copy and read it. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for many months, and I'm glad that it's finally happening. So welcome to Leslie and Chris, and we'll let them get started.
How much did I offer to pay you for saying all of that? Thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it. This is one of the most difficult rooms in the world for me to hear. So just if you, well, I hope you can hear me. Let me know if you can't, and I'll certainly let you know if I can't hear you. Here you go.
Sounds great. You know, the thing I love about Leslie is obviously her sense of humor, which shows itself at every moment, including the stressful and the serious sometimes.
We try.
But Leslie, the first question, how did you get into this?
Well, that's a big question. As I say at the beginning of the book, I grew up knowing that my ancestors were quote-unquote slaveholders. And I'm 8 years old or something when I saw the graveyard that they were buried in Georgia. I never spent a lot of time in Georgia. I was from Pennsylvania. But anyhow, I went down there, and then there was one, it was a big fenced graveyard, and one tombstone on the outside of the fence, which was to Mom Scarlett, our beloved nurse, I think it said beloved, and died in 1856 and was supposedly 91 years old. I find that difficult to believe for many reasons, but particularly because she was an enslaved woman. And, you know, 91 years old would be pretty astonishing, given the kind of lifestyle, that's a bad word for it, but the kind of difficulties that she had to endure through her life as an enslaved person. Anyhow, so I knew that they were, you know, enslavers, but we called them slaveholders, and then I was told they were good slaveholders. And it wasn't until, I don't know, 40, 50 years later that a friend of mine, African-American friend in South Carolina, Joe McGill, who runs the Slave Dwelling Project, said to me, they were slaveholders. How could they possibly be good? And I think, you know, that's a basic question to ask to start with. So it was much later that I decided there must be a story here, and I want to find the truth of my family, and I set out to try to find it. And it took a long time, partly because I'm a slow writer and a slow researcher, and I had this job or two around here. And I was on the vestry. I don't know. I just say that for what it's worth. So it took me a while to do it, and I had to, you know, take trips down to Georgia and back and that sort of stuff. But it was pretty shocking what I found. Well, it wasn't shocking in a way. It was sort of in some ways, what I expected. But yeah, the research opened up a lot of doors.
Makes a lot of sense. And for me, I too, you know, find myself asking myself, why am I here tonight?
Yeah.
And I think it's because from the first time I met you, and it was after my dad had told me, you know, there's a woman in our church, and she's doing research about slavery and her own family. And get this, she's actually gone down to the churches where they worship the descendants of the people her family enslaved, and she introduces herself. And my dad just thought this was, quite frankly, insane, I think.
He never told me that.
Well, he went and he had a lunch with you. He enjoyed your company, and then I too followed suit. And I remember after we had kind of worked together on the social justice ministry, we had put on a service of remembrance for African Americans killed by police. After all, getting to know each other through that, I remember one time you sat me down and we got lunch and you asked, does anyone want to hear from a white woman talking about her own family's history with slavery? Quite frankly, does anyone want to hear about the enslavers' experience? And I thought for a long time about that. I gave you an answer in the conversation, and it was yes. And partly it's because, for me personally, it's been too painful to devote my life to that kind of research. Of course, I have the history in my family that's been passed down orally, but it's not something that I've ever been able to, write down and spend time in libraries and cite sources and collate research and consider, put myself in those shoes for long periods of time. And so I do have a profound gratitude to you for exploring that from the angle of something just fundamentally unjust, uncomfortable, and painful. And I think it's good for people that are able to do that work to spend time doing it. And to talk a little bit about my own history, I mean, often people look at me and they assume, maybe they assume I'm biracial. These days, I think a lot of people assume I'm Indian American, South Asian.
Sure.
But both of my parents are black. Both of their parents are black. And so that's 4 grandparents and further back, all descendants of the American slave trade. And in some ways, I'm evidence of the fact that there was this sort of intermingling, that it was a complicated institution, and that the pain that has carried down. And so I've taken some time to learn about African American history, and I remember in college I had a professor, he finished his lecture on slavery by saying, slavery was a complicated institution because there's stories at the end of the Civil War of masters standing in the field and saying, my people have deserted me.
My people.
Thinking that, saying, at least in words, that, they considered these people family. Of course, we know from the chains, whips, implements that were used of human bondage, we know how brutal this institution is, and it is from the work of scholars, many white scholars, that we know exactly how brutal things were. But despite all that, people want to minimize or carry through that cognitive dissonance.
Let me just say one thing. I mean, many things to say about that, but one of the people I worked with and got to know during this work is a man named Peter H. Wood, who's a wonderful historian. And he came up with the line, instead of calling it a plantation, call it a slave labor camp. And you think about just the way we have inherited this history, so to speak, and how we've packaged it all of these really centuries. And just imagine, for instance, if instead of going to Monticello or Mount Vernon, how beautiful that is, right? These big, beautiful plantations. What if it was George Washington's slave labor camp or Thomas Jefferson's slave labor camp? Just imagine how Americans might feel differently about this history. I mean, it's just incredible the way we've masked it in those ways. And the same thing, what did he call them? My children,
My people.
my
It's like,
people,
yeah.
my people. Yeah,
My
right.
people, like, literally.
Because I paid for them, and
Exactly.
I get a discount. Yeah.
Exactly. And it brings me to the passage that you had asked me to do a little reading for you, and this was the passage that spoke to me. Starts. Mary King Hillsman Pettigrew, my maternal grandmother, whom we called Mamie, she's the reason I'm here tonight, 20 minutes up the highway from her birthplace. She's the one who insisted I know the kind of people I came from, strong people, strong women in particular, like my grandmother herself, who knew more about roughing it than I'd ever learned. She spent 20 years living in the Caribbean with my Navy officer grandfather, braving scorpions and malaria while raising 3 children. At the end of it all, she only wanted more. More island sunsets and patois songs, more solitary rambles in the countryside, searching for pre-Columbian relics. My grandmother, the excavator. Except when it came to our family. She and her sisters devoted years to assembling the ancestral story, compiling photos, deciphering letters, filling in cemetery maps and genealogical charts. It was no secret we had owned slaves, as they put it, but it wasn't something they dwelt on. These things we don't talk about, Mamie said briskly and often. Little in this room in this scenario for what I'm doing tonight. And then
This night too.
yes, exactly, exactly. Let's see. And, in the story everyone liked best, the coincidence that Margaret Mitchell chose our family name for her infamous heroine. Born in the last years of the 19th century and raised on the same post-war brew of recrimination and regret that nourished Mitchell, my grandmother Mamie could not forget. It still makes me angry at the Yankees stripping the Southern family, she said in her late 70s. She preferred the golden age that preceded her birth, the years when the family field stretched to the edge of the ocean that spelled misery to millions and wealth to us. When palmettos shimmered in the twilight and blushing belles cavorted with suitors at parties like the one Scarlett O'Hara attended, she who carried our name.
Yeah. I grew up with that legend too. Not legend, it's the truth. But yeah, and how many people here, I'm just wondering, like hands up, have read or seen the movie or grew up with, we're of a certain age, right? Gone with the Wind? Yeah. And it still sells something like, I thought 30 million copies a year globally, which I find kind of definitely unbelievable. But yeah, that book and that movie have promoted this image of the South, and particularly of enslavers or slaveholders, as these wonderful people who loved loved the Mammy. It's Scarlett O'Hara, who's skinny and not very well fed, and Mammy is like big and happy and go lucky, and was sad when the war came in. Sorry, I'm interrupting you. You were going to read, but yeah, it's an astonishing lie, that book. Although it's written by a woman who's very complicated in other ways. We won't necessarily go into that, but yeah, go ahead.
No, it is, that is the fundamental cognitive dissonance you explore, and the fact that, your grandmother heard whispers of something quite terrible. I will say my grandmother never told me this herself. She was born in 1898 in Georgia, where your father now lives, by the way. Exactly.
A turncoat, he went down south.
There you go.
No, Atlanta's a good place in so many ways. My grandmother was born in 1898. She was a child in, like early 1901, whatever. And she lived in Brunswick, Georgia, which, if anybody knows the state, it's on the coast, and it's very close to the Florida border. So it's just about an hour south by car from Savannah. And she later, many, many years later, told my uncle, who then told this to me only when I started working on this book, that she had, I don't know if she called it a nightmare, but it was sort of a nightmare. She had this memory, this haunted memory, or she was haunted by it, in that as a child, and I'm thinking probably 3, 4 years old, She would stay in the house in Brunswick that was owned by the Scarletts, and she was with the Scarlett women waiting in the dark for the Scarlett men to come back home from doing something out in the night that presumably was not good. She didn't, I mean, it was a very, very dim memory, as four-year-old memories tend to be. But when my uncle told me that, I had never heard that, and I began thinking, wow, you know, what were they doing? And of course, if you've seen Gone with the Wind, it's in there. They're out lynching people and doing it with impunity and, you know, happiness. Rhett Butler says, you know, oh, he was, you know, he killed a white woman or he touched a white woman, something like that, so I had to kill him. And everybody goes like, oh, this is great. I mean, it's incredible that that was our history for, you know, up until pretty recently. So I set out to try to find out the truth of that. I assumed that this would be lynching. This is the big lynching era, or what Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Institute says, or initiative says, is the era of racial terror. So I went searching and looking for evidence in the newspapers of some sort of lynching that might have involved a Scarlett. Well, it turns out most of what I found, I mean, there's a lot of coverage of lynching, and it was all very proud. And, but they always talk about the victim and what the victim did wrong, and they give the name of the victim, but not of the people who actually did the lynching. And so then I finally thought, well, I'm just not going to be able, I mean, I searched for years, and I thought I'm not going to be able to answer that question with, you know, and find the person my grandmother might have been thinking about. And then through a sort of circuitous route, working with a genealogist in Brunswick, I've found some articles about the first legal execution of somebody, hanging of somebody in Brunswick in 75 years, and this was in 1901. And then one day I just decided to, I thought, okay, then, and one of my Scarlett ancestors was involved in that, in helping to arrest this person. There was evidence that, and he was present at the hanging of this person, 18-year-old black man named Fricey Griffin. And so I began researching, and then I decided one day, I thought, okay, at least I can say that somebody was affiliated with this kind of crime. And then one day I just decided, let me just Google Fricey Griffin 1901, and bingo, this huge trove of information about this young man's arrest, trial, and ultimately his execution. And my ancestors, a man named Stainton Scarlett, funny kind of name for me, but he was instrumental in the arrest and the charge, and he was actually present at the execution. And so, to me, that was the answer, or an answer to what my grandmother might have known. So it was appalling, obviously, and it's yet another instance of, you know, this stuff didn't end with slavery at all. It continued. And sorry, I'm rambling on here.
No.
But up until when I was working on actually the Fricey Griffin story, it was right at 2020, the COVID, the absolute beginning of COVID. And that's when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered in Brunswick, Georgia. And it turns out he was murdered by so-called vigilantes, white vigilantes, on land that once belonged to my Scarlett ancestors, where they also had, in 1861, had vigilantes going out and trying to keep our homes safe, which is exactly what these men in 2020, or in the trials afterwards, said about what they did. So the connections they're fluid. I mean, this stuff has happened. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say, that's the important work of this book, is tying the past to the present. And it's a real exercise, I think, in empathy, because you're putting yourself in the shoes of the people who were doing this violence, were hearing about this violence and doing nothing, and then some who were maybe more complicated figures, but still didn't push back in the way that perhaps you or I would, being there today. And that piece of linking the violence to the present, that resonated with me because in many ways, my life has been shaped by hearing stories of black men killed by police. And as much as it even shocks me to say this, since I was 8 years old, I remember in 1999, heard the story of Amadou Diallo, who was a man killed in New York, quite famously, and maybe it was because I was born in New York that it interested me, but quite famously, he was killed for holding up his wallet, and an officer said that that was justification enough to shoot him. And,
Wow.
you know, so at a young age, I'm thinking about this and just saying how, you know, of course the officer's acquitted, right? So I'm hearing about the trial. The officer's acquitted. They're showing, you know, there's exhibits in the trial where they're trying to say that this is all reasonable. So that's when I'm young. And then when I remember I was at a college internship in the summer of 2013, and there was a nice event. We were allowed to go out to a concert. So I'm watching a concert. It was actually the Black Keys of all things, which are not my cup of tea, but I was watching it, and I remember getting the alert that Trayvon Martin's shooter was acquitted. And I remember I'm sitting there, I'm looking at this concert, and it's beautiful. It was in Louisville on the banks of a river, and I was just like, we're never gonna get better, man.
How did it, and particularly when you were 8 years old, it's interesting, we both have these formative things when we're 8. It's one thing for me, you know, a white woman, girl, whatever, you know, I'm pretty safe. I mean, nobody's gonna come up and, they're not likely to come up and shoot me. I suppose unless I'm an ICE protester now in Minneapolis, but for you, I mean, this is dangerous. How did you, and were you raised, did your parents raise you to be fearful?
100%. It wasn't fearful so much as maybe responsible. I think that was how it was sort of framed. Keep your hands on the steering wheel, no sudden movements, don't, you know, to this day, I keep my license and my registration in my wallet rather than the glove box, because I know that the glove box is an extra thing where there could be a gun. If you say, officer, my wallet's in my right hand, I'll be reaching for it. That was a way I was taught. And my dad works as a forensic psychologist. His job is talking with criminal defendants, and so this was non-negotiable. And no, I have had instances when I was in college where officers would 100% be asking questions of me as a black man, because New Haven is quite famously, if you're white, it's very likely you're going to yell, and if you're black, it's very likely you're a townie. And so I did have situations where I had to explain myself to officers, and I often say this to talk about the white experience. I have a friend who's white. He was once stopped by a police officer because he was wearing a hoodie.
Oh, yeah.
And just wearing a hoodie was enough in New Haven that an officer might want to talk to you a little bit more.
One of the people I met, I don't remember his name, in Georgia, and he helped me just do some research, black man, but he's from Africa. And he said, you know, when he first came over to the United States, he was a student, I think at University of Georgia, and I'm trying to remember, he went out walking at night or something with a hoodie on, and so one of his white friends said, I think his name was Kwame, you know, do not, like, take that thing off right now, do not do this. I mean, and this, you know, he was African, so he had no clue that, that there was, you know, that there was a problem with this. I mean, he just simply was, and that's another astonishing thing that is so clear to me in working on this. It's like, I'm not saying that there isn't racism in other parts of the world. There's plenty of it, but we have a uniquely, it seems to me, we have a uniquely evil and dangerous, maybe, you know, atmosphere or culture for young black people,
A culture that we never faced, and a culture where the tools are fundamentally the same. You know, some of what you talk about with Freese is like, perhaps some of the stuff he was doing was very justified, you know? And I think when you read the situations of black men killed by police, there, there's, there's so much in there that you know that's a normal day. The story of Eric Garner, for example, when I would take the train up to New York, I would always hear people saying, Lucy's 2 for $1. Lucy's 2 for $1, which means they were selling loose cigarettes. That was just a common thing in Harlem. That was how people made money. Eric Garner is doing that one day, and a beat in New York needed to meet a quota, and he ends up getting arrested and confronted for selling loose cigarettes, and then he's choked out and murdered. For something I heard, you couldn't be in the Harlem Metro North Station and not hear that. So I think that's just the piece that persists in slavery times and now, is just that the wrong thing at the wrong time, and people will put the full weight of guilty until proven innocent on that interaction. And in a moment when there's guns and all kinds of high emotions and all kinds of things involved, that's when people get hurt and that's when people are killed. So, I think that there's a lot of pieces of the black experience and black flourishing, black art, black joy to talk about. But today, I think it is important to live a little bit in slavery, in the future that it's carried forward.
Well, I've heard from some black people as I was working on this. I've met wonderful, and I've made good friends with people who are descendants of people my family enslaved, and that's just been, it is one of the great joys of my life, my husband's life. But I've also, I've said to some black people, I think things have improved, or something like that, or something kind of naive. And they said, no, they haven't. I don't know.
So
we
it's
talked
interesting.
about this the other day.
We've talked about this in private and different things. And I remember reading it in your book too. The story. It kind of famously, it's come up many times. But I've actually been thinking. Often I think the opposite. So going back to that summer in 2013. So you spend the summer below the Mason-Dixon line. You think about a lot. And I remember.
What were you doing then? Where were you?
I was in an internship. I was just doing a summer internship.
And where were you?
It was in Louisville,
Oh,
Kentucky.
in
Louisville, Kentucky.
Got it.
And I remember I was talking to. They had these. It was nice because we were hosted by alums of my college, and so there were these elder white guys who were very liberal and willing to talk about all kinds of things. So one of them, he was talking to me, and I remember he was so mad at Mitch McConnell. That's like the classic pastime of liberals in Kentucky.
Who isn't?
And the world, right? In the world, in Kentucky then, and the world now. But I remember talking to him, and I said, the period of Reconstruction, right? That was 12 years. It was cut short. It was flawed in so many ways. But what if, and this was back in 2012, what if we're in the period of Reconstruction now? Like 1965 to 2012, a little bit longer, but maybe that's Reconstruction. And I remember him kind of saying, no, man, no, we've done so much, we've passed these laws, this and that. And sitting here now, obviously everyone knows who's president, seeing our history be erased, seeing all kinds of things become mainstream again, you wonder, I guess I wasn't as wrong as maybe I thought.
Well, and I have to confess, I have not read the book. I need to. Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. What was it? 8 years in. We were 8 years in power, something like that.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah, and he was referring both to Obama's years and then to Reconstruction. But yeah, I'm wondering if we should see if there are questions or thoughts or in the audience. Is that okay, Paul, to do that? Oh, you got to get you got to run to. Yeah, but you do wonder, like, I don't know, is it 2 steps forward, 1 step back? I'm curious to know what people.
I think you have to hold both thoughts in your head.
Yeah.
Things can be improving and they can be progressing all at the same time.
Yeah.
I love this book.
You got to talk louder.
I love this book.
Because you really shout. And you can buy it over there. No, I'm kidding.
I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about, one of the things you did was spend a night in slave quarters.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that was just a really strong, there's so many strong places, but that's at the beginning. And anyway, could you speak about that a little bit?
Sure. So I became a member of the Slave Dwelling Project, which is centered in. Yeah.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, can I repeat the question? What was it like spending a night in a slave cabin? Right? Is that basically? Yeah. And I think I've done 2 actual slave cabins, and then 2 kind of quasi places, one strange places that we did. But it was with the Slave Dwelling Project, and I was a board member of that for, I don't know, about 5 years. It's run by a guy named Joe McGill, who lives in South Carolina. He's a wonderful guy, and I got hundreds and hundreds of nights, overnights in slave dwellings, which are not easy to find because for the most part, like so much else of this history, we've destroyed those. You know, you don't find those cabins very, very frequently at all. But I will say I was a little lazy about it. I didn't do a ton of these overnights, and I was very lucky. The ones I did, the weather was pretty kind. It wasn't too hot and too cold, and there was one that we did that was pouring rain, but we were under, under a roof. But it does make you realize, first of all, I mean, still we were doing this rather luxurious overnight, and you think about what people lived with and how they lived, enslaved people in these cabins with 8, 9, 10, 12 people crowded into a room that's I don't know, whatever the size of something. It's so it was interesting, a lot of good conversation when we did it. You can't recreate those periods. Joe still does overnight, so if you're really interested, you can go Google Slave Dwelling Project and sign up for one. It's interesting. We did one in Pennsylvania, which I set up because it was in my hometown in Lancaster. And we forget in many ways that the North was actually quite culpable in this whole trade. And interestingly, one of the things I put together as I was working on this book, so I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Thaddeus Stevens is one of the great people there. And in fact, they're putting together a big museum. It's about to open with the house that he lived in and all of this stuff. But even he, who was an absolute abolitionist and lived with a mixed-race woman, and even he was greatly supportive and proud of the cotton industry in Lancaster, the mills, which was a huge source of income for Lancaster. And where do you think that cotton came from, honey? So we're all, the whole country is so implicated in this. Anyhow, is that the answer?
What sustained you while you were doing this research and writing?
What
Did you find any support from other family members?
What sustained me? And did I find anything?
Support in other quarters.
Support, from my family? Sorry?
Emotionally?
Happily, my brother and sister, and my mother was absolutely in favor of what I was doing. My parents, while they were alive, I hope they're still happy about it. And my brother and sister are deeply supportive, and several members of my family, my white family, have been absolutely supportive. And then there are those who are not supportive, and they don't talk to me, and I don't reach out to them. And one of my Black friends in Brunswick said to me one time, she said, well, honey, of course they don't talk to you because you hang out with us. So that was nice. But so actually the Hippard family, which is the descendants of people in my family enslaved, and there's a wonderful story that I discovered about how their ancestors escaped from the Scarletts in 1862. The Northerners, the Northern Army, took over the coast, and so all along that coast, Georgia, South Carolina, Georgia, I guess those two mostly. I don't know about North Carolina. They fled when they could, the plantations or the slave labor camps, and they went to the Union Army. And And there's a wonderful story that I found in family letters about the escape of these African Americans who escaped from the Scarletts in 1862. And in 2011, I found ways of meeting up with them in Brunswick. Somebody said, they would love this story. So it was this very awkward, sorry, I'm rambling on here, but there's this rather awkward phone conversation. She said, well, I'll just give you the phone number of this person. So I call this woman and I go, hi, we don't know each other, but my family enslaved your family, could I come to your reunion? And she was a little apprehensive, but she was lovely and she was nice. And she said, oh, we'll tell you stories, we'll feed you food, blah, blah. So I went to that reunion in 2011, and I was the only white person there. I was staying with a white cousin who lives in that area, and I said, what shall gosh, I don't know what to wear. And she just said, honey, she said, doesn't matter what you wear, you're gonna stand out. So, which I did. But I got to meet them, and I didn't know what to expect, and they were as wonderful and lovely as they could possibly have been. And there was one woman in particular, people kept saying to me, there's a woman named Avadale who wants to meet you. And I thought, okay, here it comes. This is going to be the moment when somebody, rightly so, says, look what you did, look what your family did to my family, shame on you, blah, blah. I fully expected that. And I went to Avadale, and she's passed away several years ago. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful woman, so elegant. And she had this almost stern face, but such love beneath it. And she said, she reached out and took my hands and she said, I never thought I would see a Scarlett again. And it was so moving. And it turns out, as a child, like maybe 10 years old, she had actually worked for the Scarletts in my grandmother's aunts and uncles. There were about 8 of them who all lived in this big house. It's all gone now. But she had worked for them, and she said the Scarletts were always nice to the blacks. And I thought, wow. And then for years on, I would see her, and when I would go to Georgia, we would have lunch together with some of the family, and I finally got the courage to ask her, and I said, Avadale, what did you mean when you said the Scarletts were always kind to the blacks? And she said, well, she said they just were. We were sitting at a, oh God, what's that restaurant? One of those dorky restaurants down there. We were eating lunch. And she said, and then she said, except for one thing. She said, I would make lunch, they would make lunch. She would often do all the cleaning up and all of that. She said, and then she said, they would take their lunch and eat in the dining room, and I had to go to the porch and sit on the porch and eat my lunch there. And she said, it's not like this. She pointed to the meal we were having. And I said, I'm so sorry. That's, whatever I said, I'm sorry. And she said, well, I finally learned that's just the way it was. And you just think like these little tiny minor aggressions, so like what does that do to people over time? So I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but I've given other answers.
Excellent talk, Leslie. I don't, we fall under a lot of political pressure these days, and the political pressure has a lot to do with at least certain people who still ascribe to the lost cause. I don't think people up here in the north understand the lost cause.
Okay.
Could you explain,
the lost cause, yeah.
just for the general audience, what the lost cause means?
Yeah, it's in my book. I think it came out in 1866, like 1 year after the end of the war. And I'm blanking on the name of the man who came up with it. I think he might have been a New Yorker, but he came up with the term "the lost cause," which was the idea of the lost cause in a beautiful way. The loss of the beautiful Confederacy. This great culture, which that's a huge part of Gone with the Wind. So then lost cause became kind of a phrase that it still is, that people use to describe that culture, I guess, or lack, whatever word it is, of exalting the Confederacy to the extent, and not blaming it or telling the truth about what it really was. So it's the lost cause. I don't know if I'm answering that well enough. Yeah, I'm answering my
I
husband.
mean, one of the things I was surprised to learn about was at Old Miss, up until when I was in high school, they would wave the Confederate flag at their football games. And you'd,
Oh, God.
and people kind of explain away, oh, they're just honoring, the Confederacy. They've been doing this since, the schools from 1800 or whatever. No, they started waving those Confederate flags in 1965 because they needed to remind people like James Meredith and other people.
Who's in charge?
Yeah, who's in charge, and that idea, the lost cause, that the South will rise again.
Yeah.
It was used when they felt threatened.
Sure.
So yeah, it wasn't just, it's not reverence for some continuous thing.
I don't think it's a coincidence that all of this anti-black and cultural whatever stuff that we're going through now follows on the heels of the Obama administration. I mean, that was a wonderful step forward for the country, and boy, are we paying for it, again and again and again. And I think the same thing, 1965. That would be, you exalt the lost cause. I mean, it's a great term for it in some ways because it is lost, and it ought to be permanently lost.
There's an admission there, right? There's a little tacit admission. They did lose, but it's about power. Right?
Yeah. Thank you, Paul, for running around.
I'm curious if you know whether Margaret Mitchell consciously or unconsciously named her character after your family, but I'm actually more curious to know whether your family, after this massively successful book and film came out, claimed an association with the character, and whether others came to them associating the family with the character, because I can see a huge temptation to want to associate yourself as a family with
I'm going
something
to have
that's
to ask
successful.
you to translate what he's, because it's really hard to hear.
I'm sorry, I don't think this mic.
No, it's not.
I don't think the mic is
It's the
picking up
echo
very
chamber
well.
of the room.
I guess my question, in short, would be: did your family identify itself with the Scarlett in Gone with the Wind, and did others identify that character with your family?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So the question's sort of two.
Thank you.
Right. I mean, you talk about it in the book, but did Margaret Mitchell, consciously or unconsciously choosing the name? That's one piece. But then there's the other piece of, did your family grasp on to that legacy of Scarlett O'Hara and sort of see that as a point of pride?
Yeah,
So
they were very proud of
two
that.
things.
My family was very proud of the fact that she used our name. And she did know about our family because one of my grandmother's aunts wrote to her. Now, one of the things I got wrong in the book, but it shouldn't prevent you from buying the book or reading the book. I grew up being told that this aunt of my grandmother's was so ticked off at the way she, that she used our precious name for this scandalous heroine that she wrote a letter to Margaret Mitchell saying, how dare you take this, blah, blah, use this name. And then she burned the letter. And after the book came out, a person I'd never met, never run into at all, wrote to me and said, well, actually, I have a copy of the letter that your grandmother's aunt sent to Margaret Mitchell, and it's very flattering, and she's very, happy with, and proud of the book and all of this kind of stuff. So I went, okay, I got that one wrong. But that happens when you do books.
Maybe she wrote two.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, right. There was the one she burned, and then there was the one she framed. But Mitchell did write back to this woman, my Scarlett ancestor, and say, yes, I did know about your family, of course. They're very well known along the coast, blah, blah. I mean, my ancestors, my Scarlett ancestors in that area, at the height of their wealth, had about over 400 enslaved people to their name. So they were major. They were larger enslavers in the thousands, both in New Orleans and along the coast and Sea Island and whatnot. But most Americans had no enslaved people at all. No, none. Of the few Americans that did, most had fewer than 10. So anything, as big as, I mean, certainly something as big as 400 is massive. And so they were major enslavers in that area. So, yeah, did I answer that? I apologize for yeah.
I'm remembering in the book that you were given a box. Am I remembering that somebody in your family gave you and you were going through papers and?
Oh, yeah, I actually, and I am happy to say I've given them all to the Georgia Historical Society now. So they're in Savannah. If you want to go look at them, you can see them. But yeah, I inherited all these boxes with my grandmother, and there's a lot of copied stuff in there and everything. But yeah, my grandmother, which is interesting. I mean, my grandmother, who was born she's actually the same age as Margaret Mitchell, 1898, but she did not have Margaret Mitchell's complete attitude, I think. But again, I want to just emphasize that Margaret Mitchell is a complicated person. She gave a lot of money to Morehouse College and to a black hospital in Atlanta. So she's not completely, one-sided, which is so true of history, right? In many ways, but certainly true of this history. Where was I going with that? Something about, oh, the box, yeah. So the box is just, I mean, I don't know. How many of you have boxes sitting around that you've inherited from something, right? And one of these days you're going to open it? Don't wait. But I finally started going through it, and then just piecemeal going through it and finding there's a lot of repetition, a lot of stuff, but then every once in a while, and then a lot of tedious, autographs, books, and stuff like that, and you go like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then all of a sudden you get to this thing that says, it's a series of letters from this man in 1813 writing to my great-great-great-grandfather, who was the person who started this whole enterprise in our family. And he started his life, he emigrated from England and he moved here as a young man and he became an overseer. And I see these letters written to him by this man who lived in Savannah who ran the overseers. And he's saying, when the Negroes come, give them, when the corn comes, dry it. Because otherwise, if you give it to them when it's too fresh, they'll get sick. So he cared about that, right? And then there was one at Christmas, I'm sending you a beef for the Negroes for their Christmas. And I think that might have been the only protein, or some of the only protein they got. I mean, we really kind of starved them. This man also said really terrible things about Native Americans. That I believe they all should be killed. So we have this combination thing. So.
I mean, one thing I learned early on when considering slavery, and possibly because I had white teachers, was that slavery was bad for white people. It was the cruelty. When you talk about
Really?
the money and the power. When you talk about money and power, sure, it was great.
Yeah.
But for women to be in houses where men were doing all kinds of violent things to slave women, raping women, when their overseers were whipping their own children. You talk about that in the book. When men are learning torture, I mean, as you're saying, torture, starvation, all kinds of predation.
Yeah.
From a psychological perspective, when you think of trauma and all these things, it was bad.
What's the...
I guess I'm saying it is a less safe world, I think, where for white people and white women, anyone, in a world where the people that in their family are perpetrating this level of hatred and harm.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean when I say respect for white people.
The movie and the book, 12 Years a Slave?
Yes, sure.
And if you look at that, I mean, there's so much violence in there, and you see, not that it's completely sympathetic to white women, but you see what white women were forced to deal with in many ways. And obviously there were huge, as there is with any population, there's a huge range of people. There were, horrible white women, and there were white women who were deeply disturbed by this. And then there were the names of the two women who, their papers are all at the Clements here, who were abolitionists, and they were daughters of enslavers. So yeah, but it's a totally sick society, and I think we've inherited that. And until we have these conversations and talk about this and acknowledge it, we're never going to get. I don't think we're going to get beyond it in a healthy way. Yeah.
This is a great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think what I'd like to do, and just give you an illustration of a timeline with having lived in the South for a number of years.
You did.
We did, yes. We lived in New Orleans back
Oh,
in
okay.
the late 70s. We lived in the Atlanta area in the mid 80s. We actually traveled over to St. Simon's Island for vacation and through Brunswick and all that. But from a personal experience and a timeline, and with what you're illustrating in your book, we've come a long way, but we haven't come a long way. And a couple of examples I'd like to share with you is that I had a young man who worked for me. I was based in Atlanta. This young man was based in Montgomery, Alabama. And we got talking one time. I grew up in the Northeast, and here I was, this white Northern Yankee in the South. And the conversation resulted in, the war isn't over yet.
He said that, or you said
He said that to me.
Is he white, black, in between?
He was a young white man. And he said that the Civil War, a lot of people, you people think it's over, but down here we do not think it's over. And then I had another occasion where I went into an account with another person in Georgia, well, actually in Alabama, and I opened my mouth to say something. I'm a sales guy, and we were making a sales call. And the gentleman that we were meeting with sat back. He had a big, burly guy, crew cut hair. Where you from, boy? You ain't from these parts. And the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was shocked.
He put his hand on the back?
No. The hair on the back of my neck when he said, where you from, boy? You ain't from these parts. Caused the hair on the back of my neck to raise up. What I'm just trying to illustrate is that I can't wait to read your book. I haven't read it yet. But hearing what Chris has been saying and some of the questions that have been asked, we still have a long way to go.
Well, I was going to say, maybe this isn't, I don't know where we are time-wise, but maybe ending. But, I would love to see this church continue. We did, we've done conversations, we've had things like this, but how do we keep this conversation going? Because I think one of the things I really wanted, I wanted to get the truth out about my family, but I also wanted to promote conversation, because I think one of the big problems is that for so many years, decades, et cetera, blacks and whites don't know how to talk. We're not comfortable talking to each other. Having a conversation like this, I don't know that I could imagine having a conversation like this publicly 10, 15 years ago. And I just, we need to talk to each other. We need to be comfortable. You think about all of the years when I was growing up, and my grandparents had a black woman work in their house, but we were absolutely separate in many ways. We never spoke, personally with one another, or very rarely, and I think that's been true for so many Americans forever. So I'd love to see this congregation and this community continue this conversation.
Thank you, Chris and Leslie, very much for this excellent conversation.
Thank you. My hands are freezing. Yours are nice and warm.
And thank you to Leslie for this book that shows us one way to look at our past with honesty and integrity, and the way that opens up possibilities for conversation, the way it opens up possibilities for healing and for justice moving forward. So thank you for this book. David from Literati would be happy to provide you with a copy of the book, and Leslie will be over here signing books, and we'll get that set up in just a minute or so. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.